All right, welcome to the Halava Fantasy Football League. This is the Week 12 recap. We are nearly the end of the regular season. We have a couple more weeks and then it's the playoffs. Like we mentioned last week, there was a bunch of uncertainty, a lot of a real whole slew of a bunch of teams all in the middle. Between 8 of the teams, all on the bubble for that playoff spot. Those last, I want to say, 4 playoff spots. I don't think we've ever had it that convoluted before. Anyways, let's just get right into it. Me and Milo versus mediocre minions. This is pretty clear cut. Jeremy just smashed this week 175.86 fantasy points in our league, and I just got under 100. Early on in the week, as usual, I'm still relying on the Lions, and it was the Thanksgiving game. They were hoping for a win, but they lost. Thankfully, the fantasy points kind of at least were there for the Lion players. Jared Goff, despite having losing 3 fumbles, was able to have 332 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. They nearly had a comeback if they could secure a onside kick, but it just was not meant to be. The turnovers in that game killed them. Amon-Ra St. Brown had a decent game, almost 100 yards, but almost 10 receptions. Calvin Ridley balled out, 89 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown. Breece Hall was a letdown. That Jets-Miami game, they were a disaster, and it's just sad. Jahmyr Gibbs had an okay game by his standards. Sam Laporta is back and had a big game. A receiving touchdown, 5 catches, 47 receiving yards. Jameson Williams didn't do a whole lot, but he was, I guess, okay as a wide receiver 3. Matt Prater, he gave me a donut, and the Detroit D, really bad, 0.5. Matt Prater, the funny story with that one was it was at the end of the half. He kicked like a 50-plus yard field goal, so that's like over 5 points. And there was a holding penalty, and because of that, clock runs off, end of the half, no points for Prater, and they didn't even bother using him from then on. Maybe I don't know what they were doing. For Jeremy, take a look at this pure dominance. Josh Allen, 339 passing yards, 81 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Keenan Allen, super amazing game. They kept it pretty close against Baltimore. 106 receiving yards, 14 receptions, 1 fumble loss. 102 receiving yards and a touchdown by Tyreek Hill. Raheem Mostert, 2 rushing touchdowns, 94 yards, 20 rushing attempts. DeAndre Swift was probably, outside of the tight end, his weakest player, but a solid 10.3. Evan Ingram did decent for a tight end, 49 receiving yards. Isaiah Pacheco balled out, helping them come from behind and knocking off the Vegas Raiders. 2 touchdowns. Dicker had a pretty pedestrian game for a kicker, and the Miami D, again, dominant. The Jets was just a clown show at that point. Off the bench, my best player is probably Mitchell, so a solid late pickup. And then for Jeremy, Gabe Davis really balled out, but there was no beating anybody. And then, I don't know, it's a matter of, when I could have been matched up against some other people and that would have helped, but thank you, Jeremy, for overwhelmingly dashing my playoff hopes. So let's move on to the next score. Eric versus Richie. Eric pulls out the win pretty comfortably. Dak Prescott is back to MVP form, 4 passing touchdowns. TJ McLaurin, pretty weak game, but at least he's giving you points. Zay Flowers is back, having 2 touchdowns. He was big time, so he kind of had a fast start, a little bit of a lull. Now he has a nice game again. Derrick Henry back performing well, 2 rushing touchdowns. Jaylen Warren had an okay score. Taysom Hill, solid score for a tight end. Look at the differential, 2.89 expected, 8.8 provided. Khalil Herbert didn't do much. Huge kicking game by McManus. And then the Buffalo D had 2.9. So he got suckered into keeping it for 1 more week, and this is what they do. But It was inconsequential because it helped him get the win. Richie had a Lamar Jackson 17.88 game. CD Lamb had a solid game, one receiving touchdown. Another touchdown by Stephon Diggs. David Montgomery, a solid game, 71 rushing yards. But here's where he starts to lose in the matchup. James Conner only getting 27 rushing yards. Dalton Kincaid, actually a pretty decent game for tight ends. Mixon and Hopkins and the Cleveland D, just nothing much. Not enough to close that gap of 21, 20, of about 25 or so points. Oh, the drink of the day, by the way, is black coffee. All right. And then the bench. Look at this. Eric has a lot of hope for this player, Rashee Rice. He looks like wide receiver one. And even if he's not like getting like all the targets every week, he is the big play receiver. So you may do well to move him into your starting lineup, probably taking over McLaurin, but he looks good and they're needed for Kansas City to try to defend their Super Bowl title. Najee Harris, this thing about choosing which Pittsburgh running back, you chose wrong again, but that's okay. You still got the win. And then nothing from Jones and Higgins were hurt. And then the Tampa Bay D. For Richie, it would have been good to have started Trevor Lawrence, who looks good again. It's been up and down. You know, I hear the reports about how like Lawrence is like, he's junk, and all of a sudden he has a good game like this. Really good shootout against CJ Stroud. But unfortunately, not enough to close that gap to win. I don't know if you have enough to. I mean, because these are okay scores. The only standout is Lawrence, but that's not closing the gap because it's the difference of 17 to 28. So that'll only give you about 10 extra points. Next matchup, Mike B versus Morgan. Mike, solid game. Morgan had a sad game. Jalen Hurts is pretty much carried most of that score, scoring nearly 40 with 2 rushing touchdowns and 3 passing touchdowns. DJ Moore, solid game, 114 receiving yards, even though that game was ugly. Devontae Smith, another consecutive solid game, 106 receiving yards, 101 receiving touchdowns. And so it looks like what's happening with Philly is as they're more of the weapons, it's not just like being like concentrated on AJ Brown. It's getting spread around a little bit more. They're actually more dangerous as a team, looking like Super Bowl favorites. Saquon Barkley had a down game, 46 rushing touch yards, 12 rushing attempts, and only 6 receiving yards. Nothing much from Gus Edwards. TJ Hawkinson balled out, 1 receiving touchdowns, even though they lost. Sutton had a meh kind of game, and Bass had a really good game. And your New Orleans D, not much. For Morgan, why did he lose? Well, it looked like Josh Dobbs turned into a pumpkin. The honeymoon is over, and he only had 185 passing yards. It's so funny because they were praising him for the last couple of weeks so much. He has one bad game, and then they're like, "Oh no, we were gonna take a look at the quarterback situation with Minnesota." So reactionary, it's crazy. I mean, just fix the team. He's the best you got. I don't know what else you're gonna do. Adam Thielen really let down. This might be his worst game of the year, probably. Drake London, really good game, 91 receiving yards. So they're kind of in Atlanta. Surprisingly, their weapons kind of showed up this week. Travis Etienne, not up to his standards, I would say, but still a solid game. Alvin Kamara had a good game. Njoku, solid game for a tight end, but Hawkinson gets the edge there. Chase, decent game. So I guess it shows, at least in some measure, he's quarterback proof. So even though he's not having Burrow throw to him, he's still a weapon and can be utilized. He just no longer is that WR1 level without the quarterback. I don't know. Who knows? Like we said, we say stuff like that, but the following week, all of a sudden, a player like that blows up with an inferior quarterback. Hard to say. Nothing is certain ever. Jake Elliott had a decent game, but still Bass gets the edge and a bad Houston defense. They got stomped on by Jacksonville. Off your guys' bench, Kyler Murray for Mike had a decent game, but nowhere near what Jalen Hurts had. And then for Morgan, Matt Stafford was the better would have been the better play, but I don't think you're closing the gap there. And Christian Watson balled out. Maybe the combination of those two gets you there. I mean, that's a lot of points, but this differential is pretty wide. Anyway, I think you're in okay shape, Morgan, because at least you're still 500. Next up, we were just hoping to be on time versus Bradley. This game, in terms of the playoffs, was inconsequential, and this is what I hate about the scheduling this year. This game, like, I wished at least maybe these guys could have played, that whole slew of middling players, because they have an opportunity to upset some guys, right? So can you imagine if someone like these guys played, look at these other scores. If they played like Richie or Morgan or myself, even Gary, right? What if these guys hand those guys those losses? It's they have a chance to muck it up, but this becomes like the first inconsequential game of, actually, I guess, compared to the last week. But when the playoffs really start to matter, this is a game that didn't mean much. But we'll go over the scores. Derek Carr, I guess he got close to what he was projected. Brock Purdy, not a whole lot, but they didn't need much from him. Devontae Adams, not much. Maybe they spread it out a little bit more. But watching that game, it was interesting early on because the Raiders gave them a good first punch, but it's just they got lapped in the second half by Kansas City. Brandon Ayuk, kind of underwhelming based on what we expect of him this year, but a solid score. Ramondre Stevenson, good score. 21.3, almost 100 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. But Kyren Williams is the reason why Mike wins this game. Kyren Williams had 143 rushing yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 61 receiving yards, 37. I don't think I've ever been more wrong about a player. I knew about Kyren Williams when he was coming out. I just wasn't that high on him. But here he is, proving me wrong. And then Dalton Schultz, not much there. Devin Singletary, he is RB1 in Houston, had an okay game, I guess. Nick Folk had an okay game, and then the Baltimore D was strong. For Brad, this was actually a decent game. When you look at the other scores, it's just another matchup issue. Garrett Wilson was okay. Jordan Addison, underwhelming. Bijan, like we said, the weapons showed out in Atlanta this week. I was just thinking of like how Atlanta feels like a graveyard for really talented players. Like if they were on any other roster, they would be fantasy gold. They would be fantasy gold, but on Atlanta, it's like nothing happens. But this shows, at least for one game, you can see the potential that someone like Bijan has. Guys like Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Jared Cook had an okay game. Actually, a really good game. So Cook seems like he's RB1 in Buffalo. They just fall short in this slugfest, right? They had this game, and Philly just ran right past them. This is how close it was. I think the second to the last play in overtime, Buffalo has a 3-point lead. A pass is made to A.J. Brown. He takes a couple steps, and the ball falls out. The call on the field is an incomplete pass, but it definitely could have been called a fumble because it was recovered by Buffalo. They would have won if the call was merely a fumble recovered by Buffalo. Instead, it goes back. They have another chance, and then they get a touchdown. So that's how close that game was. It was pretty exciting. Let's see. Logan Thomas, kind of a sad tight end score. Kareem Hunt, another sad tight end player. McPherson, not much for a kicker, and their San Francisco D was solid. Off the bench, Russell Wilson gave you 20.6. He was the better quarterback on the day for Mike. Nothing from anybody else. And then for Brad, Nico Collins and Jacoby Myers had really good games. That's nearly 40 points there. So maybe if you swap them out here in your flex spot and a Jordan Addison, can't blame you for starting someone like Addison. Maybe Kareem Hunt is a possibility. That probably gets you the win here. those are some of the lessons learned. Maybe you apply them to next year. And then we go to the final matchup, Gary versus James. Did I miss one? I feel like I missed one. I did. I'm gonna say that one for last. That's gonna be great for last. But so let's go to first Gary and James. Sorry, Gary. Gary, you said that it was Ruben Patterson's fault that that you lost. Problem is, they played on Thursday. I think you already knew he gave you 0 points. I guess that if he gives you, I don't know, 6 points, you never know. I mean, I guess his projection 9.78, that'll probably gets it to you. But that's a tough swing. It's the same thing that happened to me score wise because that pushes Gary 2 games below 500 and that pushes James 2 games above 500. We'll talk about the standings later. Baker Mayfield, not much, 17.66. Tank Dell, like we said, wide receiver 1 in Houston. And so that looks like the CJ Stroud Tank Dell connection is going to be here for a long time. That's pretty neat to have like 2 rookies come in at the same time and have that connection. We'll see. There may be adjustments as the years come across, but so far the early results are very promising. Puka Nacua comes down, and actually this is a pretty interesting thing because you know how Puka Nacua had a nice lead in terms of fantasy being wide receiver 1 for rookies. I believe Tank Dell overtakes him just with this score alone. Josh Jacobs, really good game, 110 rushing yards, a touchdown. Jacoby Ford had an okay game, pretty decent. Travis Kelce had a strong game, 91 receiving yards and 6 receptions. Javonte Williams, a decent game, 65 rushing yards, 18 rushing attempts. I don't know if we talked about Denver, but they just all of a sudden, they were the laughing stock of the league early on. Look at where they are now. Look how things change week after week. We already talked about Patterson. And the New York Giants D got you 3 interceptions and 2 sacks, helping you to get over that 10 points, 12.8. And then for James, who wins and is now in comfortable playoff position, Justin Herbert, kind of a sad game for him. I guess that was an ugly defensive game for the most part. Cooper Kupp had only 18 receiving yards and 3 receptions. I guess maybe he's not 100%, but at least he was there. A.J. Brown had a pretty okay game, but like we said, they're spreading it around a little. 1 receiving touchdown. He still has this potential to blow up, though, so he's still scary. Rashad White had a solid game, 100 rushing yards, 15 rushing attempts, 2 receptions. Zach Charbonnet, a little bit better, but my question is, when does Walker come back? So, because that'll definitely impact Charbonnet. Cole Kmet had a decent game, but again, Kelce wins that matchup. Deebo Samuel had a good game. 79 receiving yards, a touchdown, 7 catches. Joel Myers had a solid kicking game. So I guess you can say that kickers made the difference. And then the Denver D, solid. Like we said, Denver's looking scary. Off the bench, you had Sam Howell, so that would have gave you maybe a few more points. You had Jalen Waddle, that would have gave you more than Puka Nacua. That's a tough one, right? But yeah, Jalen Waddle and Sam Howell gives you this win, I think, Gary. So, but it's the kicker's fault. Madison had an okay game and nothing much for these guys. Douglas, okay, kind of out of nowhere. Then for James' bench, AJ Dillon had a decent game. Nothing much from Gibson and JSN. M. Thomas is on IR. I don't know when did he go on IR? Is he going to be back in time for the playoffs? You may need to swap him out. And then Tunga Viola had they didn't really need him. Pretty underwhelming game. Kind of hope for more, yeah, from that juggernaut of a Miami team. All right. So this was accidental, but I'm glad we can cover this last because this happened to be one of the closest games, and it came down to the wire on Monday night, and it came down to Justin Fields. Patrick Mahomes had a solid game for Darren. Tyler Lockett, not so much. Rashid Shaheed, not so much. McCaffrey continues to be dominant and dangerous. Jonathan Taylor. I heard someone say of this game, vintage Jonathan Taylor. And I'm like, vintage Jonathan Taylor? He's only had like 1 good season. So I feel like the bar is set low. I just watched the on Amazon Prime, Bye Bye Barry. Running backs of yore were so much better and has so much more longevity than running backs now. It's hard, right? You try to hit on a running back and you need them early because their shelf life is just not there, and running back by committee is how things are today. But yeah, Jonathan Taylor, vintage Jonathan Taylor. Ferguson, not much as a tight end. Christian Kirk, a solid game, 89 receiving yards. Harrison Butker, okay as a kicker. And the Dallas D, strong and dominant, as usual. Aaron had Justin Fields, only 16.48. We'll come back to that, but Mike Evans gets you a really good game, 2 touchdowns. Chris Olave, pretty solid again, 114 receiving yards. Eckler, kind of a letdown game, 32 rushing yards, 32 receiving yards. Still very much involved in the offense, but just doesn't produce as much. Tony Pollard, maybe this is a good sign. He's starting to put together more better games late in the season, so that bodes well for Aaron. George Kittle, not much here. A real drastic come down from last week's big game. Michael Pittman Jr., solid game, 107 receiving yards. Justin Tucker, kicking a bunch of points, and the Kansas City D, not that much. Off the bench, Chuba Hubbard gave Darren more points for the running back position. Oh no, I guess you're fine. What would you do? Would you put him in the flex? Maybe in the flex spot where you have Kirk, but I don't know. Carolina is a bad team. I understand benching him, and I wouldn't continue to. I would probably leave him on the bench if I were you. CJ Stroud had a big game. Marquise Brown, 88 receiving yards. Look at all these points on your bench. Reed, 13.2. Freeman, 77 rush yards. And the Pittsburgh D, 10.7. Ooh. And so the reason why this was such an interesting game is it was really, really close down the stretch. And it boiled down to the Monday night game, which was another super ugly game. It was the Bears versus the Vikings, and Fields just did not have a good game. The Bears didn't have a good game. His stats were pretty okay, I guess. 217 passing yards, 59 rushing yards, and 27 completions. It must be torture to watch that game and want more from Fields and need more to get that win, but the game is so ugly that you can barely do anything to catch up on Darren, and so you just fall short. I do have to apologize because I may or may not have said last week that who do you start between Fields and CJ Stroud, and then I said maybe you give Fields the edge because he's the better runner. So it's gonna be tough to decide CJ Stroud or Justin Fields. Maybe Justin Fields kind of gets the edge a little bit because of his running ability, but CJ Stroud has been really, really solid. Look at Stroud's score. That gives Aaron the win. Thankfully for Aaron, he's still at 500 and well within the playoff hunt. So speaking of, let's look at the standings. Remember, there was a bunch of teams that were, I guess, 5-6 and 6-5. 8 of us, right? So at the top, both Mike and Jeremy solidified their places there. And then at the bottom, and not really moving anywhere from 11 and 12, is Mike and Brad. But here, there starts to become a little bit more clarity. With wins by both Darren and James, they get to move to 7 and 5. That's pretty comfortable for a playoff spot. With losses to both myself, Gary, and Richie, we all fall to 5 and 7. So outside of that playoff picture, the area where there are 3 teams now in hope for these last 2 playoff spots. Right now, Eric is on the outside looking in, but that could change based on record. There is still an outside chance for us 3 to squeeze in. So let's say we win 2 more and go to 700, and maybe these guys lose 2 more and go fall behind. There's a possibility that we're still there, but you guys are in a better position. Eric is on the outside looking in. The last 2 spots are sold up by Aaron and Morgan. So that is our playoff picture. Anyway, so that's the recap for the week. Do what you gotta do, especially for this little scrum here in the middle once again, to try to make these last 2 games count. because then we go to the playoffs. I don't know. Jeremy looking really, really scary with that 175 points this week, and it does not look like they're slowing down. But anyways, that's neither here nor there.